Hello, welcome to another edition of Saturday Sauna Night. I'm Steve,
And I am Kyle.
and for episode 4, we are going to kind of do a little bit of a split episode here. A couple of random topics that we both are sort of passionate about. Um, we spent the last couple weeks focusing on Craig Lake and our shared trip there. Um, And so this week, I wanted to start it off just with a question that I've kind of been thinking about more as I've gotten a little bit older. Our very first episode, we sort of talked about how we got interested in the outdoors. And Kyle, you mentioned just kind of growing up in an environment and a location that's just kind of the norm, right? It's just what people do. Like that's part of UP culture. You go outside, you hunt, you fish, you boat, you swim, you know. You know there's going to be lots of snow, and you just kind of accept that fact. And it might snow in May, and it might snow in late September, which I don't think it actually has yet this year. And that's just it's part of life, right? It's outdoor culture, and there's a lot of areas around the U.S. and around the world that's true. But something I've been thinking about more and more is like why do I keep going back, right? So I grew up going on hikes in the woods, fishing a little bit casually, snowmobiling, lots of times snowmobiling, cross country skiing, things like that. And um, why do I keep wanting to do these things, right? Like I haven't moved off to a city. I don't spend my free time, um, you know, downtown at what do people even do in cities?
I don't know.
Go to fancy bars or coffee shops. I mean, we did a little bit of that um, when we lived in Madison, Wisconsin for a few years, but that's not even technically a big city.
Okay.
Anyway, getting all philosophical here. I wanted to kind of bring up a couple books, and I don't bring these up because it's not like I read these and then one day I was like, well, gee, I should go outside because this book told me to. This is more of like just kind of giving a new perspective on things I already was doing. Um, and so the first one I'll start with, and actually this one kind of did actually sort of spur my interest in trout fishing. This is Robert Travers, aka John Voelker's Trout Madness. Actually, its full title. Hang on. So it was written in 1960. Oh, it doesn't say the full title on here. It's got a long title that's like Trout Madness. Oh, here it is. Being a dissertation on the symptoms and pathology of this incurable disease by one of its victims. And so I initially got into reading John Voelker because I grew up in Ishpeming, which is where Voelker's from. Um, you know, I'm growing up roughly a century later, but sort of was familiar with his name growing up. Um, people would talk about Anatomy of a Murder, which was his most famous work, which wasn't even about fishing. It was a legal drama. Um, Shout out to my boy Daredevil. When's he gonna make an appearance on She-Hulk? I don't know. It was a legal drama based on a real court case that he was involved with. It was a murder case. If you don't know about the book, um, it's not exactly like a thriller page turner, but it's very interesting. It's um, it's written, I think, in simple enough language that even if you're not super familiar with legal jargon, you can get the gist of it. It's a fascinating story. Um, I don't need to explain it here, but anyway, I guess my point is I had a general familiarity with Volker growing up, and when I moved away and was starting to think more about like what am I interested in? What kind of hobbies? Like, how do I want to spend my free time as I'm becoming an adult? Um, I started looking for books and other pieces of culture, I guess, that reminded me of home. And so I was instantly drawn to his fishing writing. So Trout Madness is one. He has another called Trout Magic. They're basically, both of them are a collection of short stories. Most of them are fishing stories, but not all. And just the way he writes, he's got a kind of a dry sense of humor and a wit that makes it makes it more than just like reading somebody's fishing notes, right? And he does reference those from time to time. He kept detailed fishing logs with dates and people and water temperatures and what flies he was using and things like that. But in the introduction to Trout Madness, he says, "The simple truth is that the UP is one of the best hunting and fishing areas of the United States. It possesses three of nature's noblest creations, the ruffed grouse, the white-tailed deer, and the brook trout." And then he skips and he says, "This fact, thank the Lord, is not yet widely known. Yet it would be ironic and a hideous thought to contemplate if this little book should help bring about the discovery of the forgotten Upper Peninsula." So even back, most of these stories take place in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. He wrote the book it was published in 1960. So he was already close to 60 years old at that point and had kind of retired, I think, from law. Anatomy of a Murder, and he made a lot of money from Anatomy of a Murder. It was a best-selling book. It became a Hollywood movie. There were these Hollywood big shots hanging out downtown Ishpeming, staying at the Mather Inn, and it kind of set him up well enough where he was able to retire, from the law and write and fish full time. So that was one of the first things I ever read that sort of spurred me. Like, I had already spent time outside, of course. I grew up in the UP. I spent time in the woods, but I guess taking on a little bit more appreciative view of it, and the realization that it's a gem, and not every corner of the U.S. is like this. You don't have wilderness everywhere. You don't have, pristine streams and lakes, which we certainly have our share of polluted areas as well that are, prone to the same problems that follow irresponsible development. But one of the first things I ever read, specifically about the UP, about areas I was familiar with, but sort of shed a new light on it, I guess, and really kind of encouraged me to go out and find my own special areas, I guess, in the woods and on the water, and have a story to tell. The other book I wanted to point out, this is not about the Upper Peninsula. This actually is set in Wisconsin. So this is Aldo Leopold. This is called A Sand County Almanac, and sketches here and there. And it's not really a novel. It's kind of a collection of, sketches here and there. It's a collection of prose and narrative and borderline poetry. Leopold wasn't a poet, but he was a scientist, but he wrote almost like a poet in some of the ways he describes the natural world. And there's a million stock photos with inspirational quotes from this book you can find online. I wanted to find just one piece from his introduction here. And sort of hits on the main point of this and kind of what it meant for me. So he says right in the foreword here, this is Aldo Leopold writing in, I don't know, I think this was published in 49, but he wrote this long before that. So he says, like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. Now we face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in things natural, wild, and free. For us of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and the chance to find a pasque flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. Easy for me to say. So, Leopold, I actually just read this within the last year. Like, this is pretty new to me. And I became familiar with it mostly in trying to lesson plan as a teacher and teaching environmental science and things in that realm. And like I said, the way Leopold, he's able to really do a nice job painting pictures with words and really getting at the heart of our relationship with the natural world. And he gets into something he calls the land ethic, and how he talks a lot about ecology and the general idea is in an ecosystem everything's interconnected, and he kind of gets into where humans fit into that picture. And it kind of, for me, it just reframed, when I'm outside, I'm not just outside to catch a fish or to shoot a deer or to, go ride 5 miles on my bike or whatever. Like, that's part of it. That's part of the enjoyment. But there's a bigger picture to be seen for sure. And noticing, he spends a lot of time in his book, calling attention to small details, changing of the seasons. In fact, the beginning of the book, he goes through each month of the year, and he kind of has a different short story associated with each month, and just the little things he's noticing, and weather patterns and migration patterns of birds. And he's got this really, really well written, I mean, the whole thing's well written, but he's got this really cool piece called Marshland Elegy, where he talks about how in a lot of Wisconsin and the Midwest, in the 20th century, so many of the marshland, wetland areas were drained, right, to make way for farmland and for development, and how that kind of led to, is extirpation the right word? Not extinction, but a significant drop in the number of sandhill cranes. And it's interesting reading that, because now in 2022, we have sandhill cranes everywhere. But that wasn't always the case. I guess I'll wrap up just by saying, I don't know. I see pros and cons with the way the world is going in terms of our relationship to nature, I guess. It seems like there's an interest in being more responsible with development, like merging technological progress and being able to, better serve the human population alongside being more aware of what we do and its effect on the environment, which is good. Because I think we wasted a lot of time not paying any attention at all. The UP, you can look at the lumber barons and just slash and burn logging, and how that messed up so many rivers especially, and just the amount of erosion that generates, and irresponsible mining practices, which that's still a big debate today. But at least, I guess, if anything, modern mines at least have an awareness, if only because of their legal obligation to be environmentally friendly, but still, at least there's an awareness there. And so these are just 2 books. Again, there's many more. One I'm going to start reading soon is called Walden by Henry David Thoreau, which I think might have been exposed to in high school, but didn't really didn't really have the right mindset, I think, to read it then. But okay. Well, before I go on for too long here, Kyle actually wants to talk a little bit about something he's been getting into the last few years. And I'll just kind of preface it by saying he's going to talk about coffee. And, like a lot of areas of the world, we're big coffee drinkers in the Upper Peninsula. We have a significant population of Finlanders who love their coffee and Italians who also love their coffee. So that sort of leaves us here. But you've actually been getting into roasting your own beans, right? And
That's what I do.
and trying different, what do you call it, a roast profile? Is that the right word?
Could be,
Does that just refer to how dark or light it is, basically?
pretty much.
So how do you control that? And how do you, I guess I've never tried roasting coffee, but how do you ensure your temperature you're roasting it at is going to make it taste good?
The beauty is kind of in the eye of the beholder with coffee. Obviously, you and I'm sure a lot of other people on the planet have heard of things such as light roasts, medium roasts, dark roasts. As you might suspect, light roast means you roast them less. Dark roast would be hitting a higher temperature or leaving them on for longer. Those are kind of the two levers you have to pull when you're achieving whatever level you want to. A pretty common misconception is that strong coffee means dark roast, and that's not really the case. How strong your coffee is actually going to be a function of how much you use and your grain size, and how long you take to actually brew it, which is kind of a whole nother ball game depending on whether you're doing cold brew or hot brew. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I guess to start off, your roast. I have a roaster that is on the other side of the room. I'm not going to pull it out now because I shot some video and took a couple pictures, so you can probably see how it works from that. We'll tack those into this video. This one's a hot air roaster, and it just constantly turns a cylinder full of beans, 8 to 10 ounces it can handle, for whatever time, however hot you want it to go. I tend to be a light roast guy, just because with lighter roast you tend to get, as weird as it sounds, fruitier, kind of floral flavors in your coffee. Dark roast is where you really start to get chocolatey and caramely, which is good, but I tend towards the lighter ones.
That's interesting because I don't know a lot about coffee roasting. I mean, I'm a daily coffee drinker, but I don't know a ton about what you're talking about here. But that's a similar thing with different types of beers as well, right? Like a lot of the light,
So.
yeah, like a lot of the lighter styles, pale ales and lagers, and you can get into wheat beers and sours and all sorts of things. But they tend to be fruitier, lighter tasting, crisper, tartar. Where the dark ones, you bring out. Actually, I've had some beers that taste like coffee.
Well, some beers use coffee, actually.
Yeah.
It's a similar concept, though, yeah. Another, I don't know if it's a common misconception. It's something I always thought, is that darker roasted coffee had more caffeine content.
I was just going to ask that.
It's the other way around.
That is a misconception. Yeah. So is that true that light roast has more?
Yeah.
Really?
Burn off less by not cooking it as much.
That's what I thought. And then I've read other stuff that said the, I don't know if it's the melting point or whatever, but the boiling point or whatever it is of caffeine is too high. I don't know. You sound like you know what you're talking about, though.
I guess on on that small of a level, I don't really know what's going on with the caffeine, if you're vaporizing it or what. But I do know that you get more caffeine in a lighter roast, however that works, thermodynamically. I guess one other interesting thing about roasting coffee is there's actually a lot of water in those to start off. So when you're roasting it, I'll try not to go into thermodynamics too much, but it starts getting warmer. But then as the water's vaporizing, it's that's what a lot of your energy is going into while you're roasting the bean, is just vaporizing that water, and your beans crack. It's called the first crack, and that's the release of some of your water and some of the other gases that are trapped in there. There's also a second crack. That's when you start to get a darker roast. So usually you try to aim between those two. It's a literal crack. You can hear it. Kind of interesting. What else do you want to know?
Well, I guess I'm curious. So you talked about a lot of that energy going to just evaporate that water content from the beans. So does that, like, how does that factor in? Like, how do you ensure the beans you're using are the right moisture content, I guess, for what you're trying to get?
Well, once you evaporate that water out of there, they're much lower in moisture. I can't remember what the exact figure is, but it was a very low percentage of water in the bean, pretty much nothing, after you roast them. Obviously, if you get them wet after you roast them, you don't want to do that unless you're actually making coffee at that point. I guess one other thing I could mention is a grain size. If anybody grinds their own coffee, if you get it in a bag at the store, you don't have much say in the size of it. But if you buy whole beans and you have a grinder and you're choosing between coarser and finer grinds, it kind of depends on the application. If you're doing something like a French press just for the sake of ease of handling, you're better off a little bit coarser. Otherwise, it just gets a little bit messy if things are too fine. But theoretically, the finer grain size you have, the more flavor you can extract. It's a surface area thing, so you're maximizing your surface area there. Like for a drip coffee, which is what I typically make I usually go for medium to fine, somewhere in there.
One thing I'm wondering about is when you go to a coffee shop, or even if you're buying a better roast of coffee at the store, you're not getting Folgers, but you're getting something, a locally roasted whatever. You'll see Ethiopian, Guatemalan, Nicaraguan. Like, what are those places of origin? Like, are there like distinct flavors of beans you get from those regions?
Yes, and off the top of my head, I can't speak too much to that. I know I mentioned to Steve before this, I have a reference book for that kind of thing that I wouldn't mind bringing back sometime and kind of cover a few of those, because certain regions you'll get very distinct coffee beans, and you kind of figure out the ones you like. But if you ever hear the term single origin, that just means it's a single kind of bean from one place. Typically what you'll do when you're making coffee at a large scale is you'll blend more unique, hard to get your hands on coffees with like a Colombian bean or Brazilian, something that's pretty common and you can get cheaper. It's not that that's lowering the quality of the coffee by any means. It's just they're trying to make it as cheap as they can while still bringing out those unique flavors. So
Yeah.
on a small scale, like at home, I'll typically just stick to single origin. But
Well, it sounds a lot like Scotch, right? Scotch whiskey, which single barrel I think means the same thing, where that whiskey isn't a blend, but it's from the same batch of grain that's been distilled, right? Same idea.
believe it or not, some of those more common ones like Colombians and Brazilians are actually some of my favorite single origins. Just they're really hard to ruin. They don't burn very easily. And the Brazilians specifically, I've found that if I can get a light enough roast, they almost have like a peanut butter sort of aftertaste. It's not like, when you talk about flavors with coffee and you say like something tastes lemony or strawberry, it's not like you're eating a Laffy Taffy or a bag of Skittles, but
Right.
you can taste it. So
That reminds me, one of the best coffees I ever had, just unique flavors, and I don't remember what origin it was or whatever, but there was this place that used to be in NMU called, I think, Stone Creek Coffee. I think they're based out of Milwaukee, but they had this one. It was like summer something, but it had like graham cracker and like lemony flavors in it, which sounds really weird to say about coffee, but it was really good. It was like really bright tasting, but not like astringent, not like super acidic. Yeah. Is it true that there's a coffee where like a jungle cat eats it and then poops it out and then they use the beans?
I don't know.
I thought, I
That
thought,
might be true.
I swear, maybe I'll have to look on Snopes later. Yeah.
About a year ago, I tried a really interesting coffee. Probably just a once or twice in a lifetime thing. It was $30 a pound just for the dry beans. Truth be told, I don't remember where they were from. Even I'd have to go back and look. But it was. I remember a really distinct kind of like a rustic, woody flavor. Not like chewing on plywood, but it was just a really interesting cup of coffee, kind of a different grade.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't think I've ever had anything that high grade before. We typically we like the McCafe kind that you can buy in bulk at the store, which to me it tastes a lot different from what McDonald's serves in their restaurants. I don't know if they just brew it really weak in the restaurant. I know they contracted out Kraft, like the same company that makes Kraft mac and cheese, for a while, and now I think Green Mountain, or one of those big companies that makes like K cups and all that stuff, I think they make it now.
Water temperature also plays into it quite a bit. So if they're brewing their coffee hotter or colder, that would definitely change the flavors.
So I've known people who have worked as baristas or in coffee shops, and I've heard about like, especially with pour overs and French press, like scalding the beans if you just pour boiling water in there. Is that
I
anything you're familiar with?
I don't know of that term specifically. I know that typically you don't want to use boiling water. I mean, unless like you're camping at Craig Lake and you don't have great control over your water temperature.
Well, we
then
didn't get it boiling. I stopped it short of boil.
You take what you can get is kind of my point when you're camping. But
Yeah.
there's a it depends what you're going for too. Obviously, a cold brew you're not gonna use hot water, but you don't want it boiling.
So, how do you roast the beans differently if you're making a cold brew? Or is it different?
It's actually a good question. I don't roast them any differently. The only thing that's really going to change is the actual brewing process. Hot coffee takes a few minutes. Cold, like an actual cold brew, 12 to 16 hours.
Wow.
So my method there is usually just to dump the grounds and the water into a French press and stir it and toss it in the fridge overnight.
So, something I've wondered, maybe it's just marketing, but is there a difference between a cold brew and an iced coffee?
Iced coffee is made hot and then cooled down
Oh, okay, so there's a
from being
difference.
hot.
So do they, I'm assuming they have to make it pretty strong if they're putting a bunch of ice into it.
Yeah, I don't know how you typically cool that down, if you just dump ice directly in there, if you just soak it in cold water,
Yeah.
bath, or what the deal is there.
Hmm.
I would not recommend throwing a bunch of ice cubes into your coffee. It's just going to be a glass of water at that point.
Interesting. So what's your, well, you said you make drip coffee a lot, but is there, like, if, you were going to sit down and make yourself a really good cup of coffee to enjoy, what would be, what, how would you make it?
I don't know. It depends on the bean. Um, a lot of the times when you're buying them, it'll tell you what flavors to expect at different roast levels. So I'd find one that I like. Like I said, that's usually on the light side because that's where you get those really unique fruity flavors. Roast up a couple of batches and let them cool, and then grind them. That's an important thing to do too. You let it cool after you roast it before grinding. Let it sit overnight. A lot of people recommend you actually go longer than that. You probably don't want to make a cup of coffee with it right away anyway, but I'd at least one night. I'll let it sit. Toss it in the old Technivorm. That's the kind of coffee maker I have, and I use distilled water in that thing too.
Does that just cut down on, like, the mineral buildup?
Yeah, I've found that if you just use tap water in those things, I've had to send cleaner through it a lot more often. So I prefer to just use distilled. And there's people that say it doesn't taste as good. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. pH is another thing that you can go explore, like the underworld of Reddit, and see people's opinions
I
on
love the way you described that.
water pH playing into coffee, but that's not something I necessarily have a ton of control over. I know you can get like pouches of some kind of powder you dump in there that brings it to whatever the optimal pH is. I want to say it's slightly basic actually for making coffee, but I don't have any of those, and I'm not going to start pouring like toilet bowl cleaner in there either, so I stick with distilled water, and it tastes just fine. The thing that really sold me on getting a Technivorm, that kind of coffee maker, is the copper heating elements are supposedly really good at heating your water to a really consistent temperature, as opposed to like your $15 coffee maker off the shelf at Walmart that just heats the crap out of it until it's done. I forget what the specific temperature is, but this one's really good at controlling that temperature to like within a degree. So,
And will it, once it's done brewing, will it hold that temperature in the pot? Or how does that work?
so if you really want to be technical, you're not supposed to keep your coffee hot after it's made. You can insulate it really well, and Technivorm actually makes coffee makers that do that too. But the style I have does have a heating plate, and it's a glass pot like a lot of other coffee makers.
Yeah.
There's two settings. I forget what the higher one is, but I use the setting that holds it at 145 Fahrenheit.
Dang.
Yeah. I just prefer to keep it as cool as possible once it's made, but I'm also not going to just set it on the counter, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I can, when you say that, I can taste instantly, like, just coffee that's been sitting in the carafe all day. Just, it's a weird burnt, yeah, just nasty.
Yeah. I mean, coffee is mostly just water. But, you know, you leave it on that burner for too long and it's sitting there kind of cooking after you've made it, and That only takes away from the cup.
Some off flavors, hey. So, I want to ask you this before we wrap up. Pumpkin spice, are you for it?
Yeah.
Really? From a true coffee expert, he's okay with pumpkin spice. So, men especially watching, it's okay. Have a pumpkin spice latte. Snuggle up with a blanket on the couch. Watch a fall movie.
You mean in coffee?
Oh, I said a pumpkin spice latte, but I suppose, I mean, they make pumpkin spice black coffee too.
Pumpkin spice in general is very good. A couple of years ago, I really stocked up on the Special K pumpkin spice, but drink your coffee black, kids. There's no reason not to.
Yeah, I mean, at some point it stops being coffee and it starts just being, you know, other things with a little bit of coffee flavor, right? Anything else you want to add? Any I'm curious about this video we're gonna put in here. What kind of a roast did you do?
It was forget the full title. It's a bean from Mexico. I did 2 batches that were about 9 ounces apiece in the coffee maker, or the coffee roaster rather. This one I actually took on the darker side, just the recommendations from the site I got these beans from says that most people tend to enjoy a medium or dark roast, so I brought them up to a max temperature of 431 Fahrenheit, a little higher than I normally go. You can still go higher than that and be fine, but you know, it's a little bit subjective, but turned out on the darker side for me, and I haven't tried it yet, but hopefully it pans out pretty good.
I think you should save a little bit, and next time we film, we'll drink some.
As long as it's not like 8 at night. It is caffeinated.
We'll record in the morning next time.
Okay.
Troy and Abed in the morning. Nothing to do with our podcast, but I'm just ecstatic at the fact that there's a new Community movie that's finally been greenlit. Hashtag 6 seasons in a movie. It's coming true. Finally. Thanks for checking out Saturday Sauna Night. I'm Steve.
I'm Kyle.
And we'll see you again next week. And I'm sure we'll be talking about something.